Okay. Okay, well, hello everyone. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being so patient with us despite this terrible technological trouble. The progress is still not there. I am Jana and Berankova. I'm here today to introduce this little volume, which we published in our Suture Press or Édition Suture in French. And I'm very happy to welcome my co-panelist, Étienne Balibar, at least in his digital presence, whom I hope I don't have to introduce. Then Petr Kouba, here, who's a researcher at the Institute of Philosophy and author of books such as Margins of Phenomenology from 2016 and Unchaining Solidarity from 2024, which is actually this book you co-edited with Dan Swain, Petr Urban, and Catherine Malabou. And also your more recent book called View from the Outside, Reflections on Social Ontology from 2024. I'm joined here on my right by Alex Taek-Gwang, who's a professor of philosophy and cultural studies at Kyung-hee University in Seoul, one of the editors of the famous volume of the Communism After Deleuze, and also author of books such as your book on Deleuze and the idea of communism, and your book on the philosopher's reading of paintings called The Colors of Concepts. And very soon you will be publishing a new book on weak technologies. And I'm Jana Ndiaye Berankova, so I'm acting here mostly like as I would say a maîtresse du salon, so I won't be talking too much philosophy. I just wanted to briefly introduce those books that we do, so I'm acting here as a publisher. And you can also, at the end of this event, if you want to purchase books, you can buy books. Here we have a little credit card machine. So when we began working on this book, we had this idea basically of launching a small series or a series of small volumes of books called, which we ended up calling Constellations. And so this little volume by Étienne Balibar that we'll be discussing today is actually the first of our constellations. It's a series of books that will be published simultaneously not at the same time, but both in English and in French, with cutting-edge Czech design. I would like to thank Nela Klímová for her amazing work on this graphic design, inspired actually where we try to illustrate the idea of war, but we didn't want to show Gaza or Iran or I don't know what, so we actually went back to the Trojan War and the Roman friezes because we think there was enough atrocities already in the antiquity. So the graphic design, those little constellations inspired by that. And I would obviously like to thank Étienne for so generously supporting us with providing his manuscript. And obviously the idea of constellations comes from, as you know, Mallarmé, but also Walter Benjamin. Overall, the publishing house is about seeing the books as constellations, namely trying to look for the kind of perfect, material form for conceptual idea. So we're very much focused on the quality of paper and binding, trying to not to give up actually on the intellectual content. And so I just want to briefly announce, so our next book, The Constellation, number 2, is actually coming out in September. It will be a little book by Czechoslovak Marxist theorist, 3 essays of his, Karel Taige, first translation in English, accompanied by a preface by Petr, who's an expert on Karel Taige, who now runs the NYU Prague, wrote a very nice piece on sort of Karel Taige as he calls it Western Marxism in Central Europe, which, anyway, whatever we think about the concept of Western Marxism. But it's a very beautiful piece that will be in this book. And we're also publishing out of the series a very thick, shining silver volume on mathematics and ontology, edited by Tsuchiento, from the University of Bristol, and both of these books should come out in this fall. So you can follow our website, and you'll see what's going on. And there will be probably like 3 constellations per year next year, but we didn't announce the manuscripts yet, but stay tuned, it will come. And you can also see our books, which actually this is my book of interviews with Alain Badiou. If you read French, I just want to bring your attention to this because this took us like 10 years, it's like 10 years of work in this book. So have a look at it. It's a book on the theoretical intersections between Alain Badiou's philosophical system and his so-called masters, so like Plato, Hegel, Althusser, Lacan, and so on. And on this, I'm gonna stay silent and pass words to my invitees today, and maybe we'll start with Étienne. Étienne?
Okay.
Vous pouvez commencer.
Yes. Can you? Yes. So first, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, it works.
Okay. No. Okay. I hope so. I hope it works. Because on my side, the sound and the image as well, but the sound is very intermittent. Sometimes it fades.
No, here it works well. You can start talking.
So I don't know if the problem is on your side or perhaps on. Sorry?
You can start talking. We hear you very well.
Okay, so I hope I'm not interrupted by the technology. I want to say something first. That is, I want to express my gratitude and my thanks. First of all, to you in the audience for coming to this event, to this presentation of my work. And I have to say that I very much regret that I'm not able to travel anymore and therefore come to Prague, which is a city very, very dear to my heart, to which I came several times in the past, even in difficult moments. So I thank you very much for being here and listening to our discussion, and perhaps, or at least I very much hope so, also participate in the discussion. I'm of course very willing and ready to try and answer questions. The technology is not something I like very much, but it's better than nothing. Second, I want to express my enormous gratitude to Jana and her designer, Nela Klímová. They produced this little book I hope you have seen, which is, I have to say, a marvel. Never in my life I was published in such a beautiful design and presentation. So it's an enormous pleasure for me to be in this series. And finally, I want to express my gratitude to the other speakers who generously accepted to be there. And just a couple of brief remarks. Of course, I'm not going to summarize what there is in English, but because in a sense, this is not votre connexion internet est instable. Okay, so in a sense, this is not exactly a book that you can summarize. It's a collection of 3 separated essays dated from very different moments. When Jana asked me to give her or send her something I had written that could be published in a small book like this. The issue of war was already very much, of course, on our minds. And on the other hand, I had in my drawers, so to speak, a couple of papers on this subject already published in French, but in places where you can't find them. And therefore, I imagined I could put them together. This was the first chapter of the book now, a piece I wrote some years ago about, it's a little convoluted, it's a commentary on the commentary that the great French philosopher Simone Weil has written about Homer's Illiad and the problem of force or violence, which in my opinion is one of the most beautiful pieces ever written on the tragic dimension of war, starting, of course, returning to the ancient times. And then there was an essay, probably less, I hope it's not too boring, an essay that is a little more, say, academic, if, perhaps in its shape, that I had written some years ago at the time of the so-called Second Gulf War, when the American armies invaded Iraq, as you perhaps remember, under President George W. Bush. And this was an essay on the internal contradictions or tensions, I would rather say, and the multiple consequences of Clausewitz's theory of war as a continuation of politics. And finally, I thought that I could not publish a volume about philosophy and history of the question of war without any reference to the fact that we were precisely, and we are more than ever today, living in a situation where war surrounds us, and in fact we are directly or indirectly involved in a state of war. At the time, it essentially related to the war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine, or more generally Russia and Western Europe. And today, of course, it also involves other dimensions in the Middle East. So I looked for a piece I had written that would, at least in the principle, address what I perceived to be the multiple dimensions of this state of war. And therefore I selected a paper which I had given at a conference in Paris at the very beginning of the recent war in Ukraine, that is in 2022, where I, of course, gave my opinion and expressed my position related to this new war, and particularly the question whether it was just or legitimate to support militarily and diplomatically and financially the Ukrainian state against the Russian invader, even when one doesn't buy, I would say, many of the discourses and strategies that are proposed by the West, to which we belong, NATO and so on and so on. So with time, of course, many of the predictions and the commentaries that I had proposed in this paper have proved wrong. No doubt, but I believe that this will be inevitably the case whenever one tries to analyze and diagnose situations of war in the middle of the war. And I believe that at the very least, my interpretive hypothesis about the multi-dimensions of this war can be remain of interest. So with this notion of interpretation, I come, if you give me a few more minutes, I will come to another aspect, more general, that I want to present. So I organized this quick commentary around three notions or ideas very quickly. The first that I want to introduce is the idea that that Europe, citizens of the world, philosophers, and so on, have become aware progressively that we live in what Walter Benjamin called a normalized state of exception. A famous text called The Thesis on the Concept of History, which not by chance was written in the very beginning, at the very beginning of World War II. So a normalized state of exception, to put things in a nutshell, is a situation in which what is supposed to be by political theory, legal theory, etc., and even philosophies of history, to be the normal relationship between states of war and states of peace, or more or less peaceful situation, is now obviously completely reversed. The traditional view remains incorporated in legal discourses and rules and codes and international law, is that the societies, nations, states live in a condition of peace that can become interrupted sometimes more or less durably, more or less brutally, by events or moments of war. So that the war is what interrupts the peace, and the question becomes how to return to the situation of peace. So we need to become aware, and this is tragic in many respects, that the world is not to be understood or interpreted in these terms. The fact is that we live, and we have been living for a long period, in a permanent condition of war. Now, this war, of course, is local, or it tends to become global, which is frightening. It moves, it changes place, it changes modalities between different types of strategic situations. But this is the permanent situation. And therefore, peace, if it exists, or where it exists, and to the extent that it can be achieved, is an interruption that we hope to be broad and lasting between situations of war. This is a reversal of the traditional view, and of course it has moral consequences and political consequences, or better said, consequences on the very concept of what we call politics. So the second notion that I want to introduce is, and I'm sorry if I seem to be a little long, is the notion of a catastrophe, which I take not only in the ordinary sense, something terrible that happens to us or to the mass of our contemporaries, but also in the etymological sense of the ago, when I was still a professor at at Columbia University, where I had the enormous pleasure and luck, and was lucky enough to have Jana Berankova as one of my students or auditors. I gave a talk in which I spoke of the three catastrophes under which our humanity, and wider, more than humanity, the living being on this planet, are now living. So one of them, of course, is very well known. It's largely understood in such terms. It's the environmental catastrophe, global warming, the death of the destruction of the biodiversity and many species, and so on and so on. I completely agree, of course, that this is a catastrophe, which means, of course, that with respect to the past, the conditions in which we are now living are, so to speak, upside down. Then I said there is a second catastrophe, which is precisely the generalized state of war. And I said there is a third catastrophe, which some people, of course, that's the core of a very active debate, would not call like that. For some people, it's it's a bounty. It's the future. It's a beautiful future for humankind. For others, it's a very destructive phenomenon. I think we need a careful appreciation of the situation. But in the etymological sense, it's a catastrophe. It's not only a revolution, but it's a catastrophe. This is the digital revolution of our age. And of course, the interesting point for me, but it's also a question mark. There's nothing ready made to understand and explain this. Is the interaction, of these three independent from one another. So the environmental catastrophe, the generalized state of war, and the digital revolution are permanently intersecting. And of course, this totally changes the conditions in which in the recent past, especially modernity, and in that modernity I include, of course, the great philosophers Hegel, Marx, and their successors, have tried to make sense with what they perceived to be the course or the line of development of history and the possibilities of transforming the world with political means. So this doesn't mean, of course, that all the old systems and ideas from Plato or Hegel to Badiou or Marx are deprived of any interest. Of course not. They are extremely rich and elaborated intellectual constructions, but the understanding of the articulation of history and politics that they proposed is undoubtedly put into question. And finally, I'm sorry if I was a little long, I want to bring back a notion that I use somewhere in the volume, at least in the forward, in the introduction, and again in the concluding remarks, which is not my own idea. I retrieve a word that was proposed in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, by a great Marxist historian and theorist and activist, the British historian Edward Palmer Thompson. Edward Thompson published, perhaps some of you know that, or others have forgotten it, published in the early 1980s an essay whose title was a kind of imitation and parody, I could say, of the famous title by Lenin. Lenin had written the essay called Imperialism, the Last Stage of Capitalism, and Edward Thompson published an essay called Exterminism, the Last Stage of Imperialism. This was at the time of one of the moments of great tension in the Cold War between America and the Soviet Union or Russia, and particularly the moment when a new generation of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons had been installed in Europe on both sides of the great border or frontier between the two systems. And so Edward Thompson published this essay, which launched an international discussion in which I took part at the time. And of course, the central theme was the idea that we are now living under a permanent global threat of destruction. Interestingly, Thompson insisted not only on the fact that nuclear weapons have the capacity to destroy our cities and civilizations. Incidentally, if you look at the pictures from Gaza today, it looks like Hiroshima, and we know that the power of the times, the power of the Hiroshima bombing. So this is not without comparison. But Edward Thompson also insisted on the idea that scientists at the time had demonstrated that a generalized nuclear war would propose a climactic catastrophe, except that it would not be a warming, but it would be a cooling of the Earth. Now, I'm not using exterminism exactly in the same sense. Not because I would minimize the permanent risk that a nuclear confrontation arises between today's states and powers, but because I believe that the notion of exterminism can be expanded, and that in fact the state of war in which we live today is a situation in which massacres at grand scale are taking place and will take place. And of course, some of them can be labeled genocides. This is the case for the Gaza genocide. There are others as well, in fact, Sudan and so on. So I have a very pessimistic view, I must admit, of the situation in which we live, because I believe that it is a situation in which war is not just a duel between armies, as Clausewitz would famously propose, but it also involves destructions of life and human life at a mass scale. Now, I return in one word to my starting point, which is the subtitle of my book. I called it Sur la guerre, on war, almost the same title as Clausewitz's famous title, except I have no pretension to Trois interprétations, three interpretations. So let me just put simply that if we remember the famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach by Karl Marx, until now the philosophers have interpreted the world. It's es kommt drauf an, sie zu verändern. It would be time now, the moment, the imperative now would be to transform it. And one of the greatest, Ernst Bloch, has added to that an idea which I always found very important, the idea that in order to express the idea that the world has to be transformed, you need to presuppose a kind of ontology, if you like, or a philosophy of history in which Veränderbarkeit. So I am not saying that the world of generalized state of exception, of catastrophes, and of exterminism cannot be transformed. I'm not saying that. I'm very pessimistic, but I'm not nihilistic. So I don't say it cannot be transformed, but I simply say that the task for us, citizens, philosophers, and so on today, if we want to transform this world, which is more and more uninhabitable, is we need more interpretations, and of course the resources for the interpretation come from different sources, different types of discourse. In my text, the last one is a kind of political analysis of the present. The references to Clausewitz are references to political and philosophical and philosophy of history. And the first one is a reference to poetry and the understanding of the tragic. I do believe that we need these three kinds of resources: poetry, history, and politics. Thank you, and forgive me for if I was too long and perhaps a little boring. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Étienne.
Oui.
Étienne, I hope that you hear the loud applause here. Étienne?
Sorry?
I hope, Étienne,
Yes.
that you hear the loud applause in Prague.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
I think I would like to pass word to Alex, but since Étienne, you might need a little break, I would like to first ask quickly, maybe do like few minutes for questions for Étienne so that he can have a break. I would like to ask if there's like some questions for Étienne Balibar from the audience. And you know, we don't have a, like, you'll help me with the micro. Okay.
Yep.
Thank you. Question? At this one.
It's not an obligation. You don't have to ask questions.
I think they're too shy. Nobody. Alex, do you have a question? Or Petr? Can you say something? There's one question there. Finally.
Thank you. I hope I'm audible. Good evening, Étienne. Thank you very much. I haven't yet read the book. I wanted to ask regarding the three catastrophes that you brought up, because very often it seems there is a claim that the first catastrophe, at least, is kind of forgotten over the new generalized state of war, whereas the third catastrophe is, of course, advancing under that state. So I'm interested in the idea or the question whether you could say a bit more about the imbrications or the interconnections of the three catastrophes. It seems that the generalized condition of war exacerbates the other two catastrophes, while at the same time sort of immobilizing or paralyzing our ability to react. I think the question maybe didn't go through.
Étienne, vous avez entendu la question?
Étienne? Non, absolument pas. Ça a été interrompu deux fois.
Okay,
et en plus, j'entends très...
Yeah. Okay. So maybe I'm gonna repeat the question. So the question.
Yes, please do that.
Yes, the lovely person from the audience here asked the question about the imbrication of those three catastrophes that you mentioned, saying that if you could maybe explain how are these three catastrophes interlinked? Because, for instance, like if we think of war, it's speeding up the other two catastrophes. Like what is the connection? What is the link between those three catastrophes in your view? Am I paraphrasing it right?
Yes. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, we do hear you.
Okay. So you'll have to forgive me because I'm not able to propose a complete theory. When I wrote this essay, I was not this little essay, a lecture I gave at Columbia a few years ago. You can find it on the on YouTube if you want. So I thought that I would propose something like an interpretive hypothesis for the situation in which we live today, but certainly not a summary of a philosophical or political system. So I see the idea of this triplicity of catastrophes, and the idea of the multiple intersections between the three phenomena as a kind of guiding thread for further reflection and examples. Now, of course, the easiest way, and I just add two quick remarks on this, is the easiest way, and I find it important, of course, and significant to answer the question, is to give illustrations of the ways in which each of them, taken in isolation or singular as a singular process, produces consequences into the others. So examples are easy to find, but perhaps not always put at the center. You can say, for example, that the permanent state of war in which we are living today has catastrophic consequences. So it is already clear, it should be clear, and this is something that our governments carefully avoid to mention, that that as the state of war expands with new wars, Iran, etc., there will be others, and continue in time, the consequences on the climate change will be disastrous. Not only because the very massive use of weapons is one of the processes that destroys the environment, but also, of course, negatively, so to speak, between the resources and the political projects and plans are now diverted completely from the questions of climate change and environmental change, and geared towards the politics of war and destruction. Another way of, but then of course you could ask a question about the reciprocity of this process, that is, whether the environmental catastrophes has or can have consequences on the contemporary developments of war. I ask the question. I believe that this could be argued for, but I don't have ready-made examples and arguments. Then, of course, there is the case of the digital revolution. So the discussion about this intersects, obviously, with the other two catastrophes in at least two very simple and massive ways. On the side of the state of war, because the wars in which we are living now, the exterminist dimension of war, involves at the same time, as we have seen, and sometimes they merge completely into one another, a return, as has been said, it's not a return because it's existed for years, of the massacres that characterized great wars in the past. It's been, for example, explained, and it remains on the agenda, that the trenches at the mobile front or border between Russian troops and Ukrainian troops is a place of human massacres. At the same time, the use and the technology of the weaponry is increasingly modified by the digital revolution, and we are even reaching. This has been seen in Gaza, in Iran. It's even the case probably in Ukraine, that human decision for the use of these weapons, the choice of the targets, etc., is increasingly transferred to the algorithms and the what some commentators have called algorithmic governmentality, or in this case you could call it strategy, which philosophically also means that the war as a social relationship, is increasingly alienated, I would say, in the form provided by the digital revolution. And the other aspect of that comes from the fact that at the beginning, at least a decade ago, I would say, it's been widely explained, this was propaganda, of course, that the digital revolution would be a very effective instrument or means to turn around the tendency towards environmental destruction, because it would substitute dirty coal and oil energies with electricity, etc. What is now becoming increasingly visible is the fact that the development of artificial intelligence is even more or just as destructive of the environment as the old technologies used to be, because it adds to the tendency of the extraction of rare earths and so on, and because the construction of the huge data centers requires enormous amounts of energy. So intelligence artificial is not clean, but it's precisely environmentally destructive. And I could continue like that. But then, of course, this would not give something like a kind of general articulation of the three catastrophes. So the general articulation I give only in one word, in a negative form, returning to what I was saying a moment ago about philosophies and history, etc. The combination of the three catastrophes is a change in our relationship to time. Of course, it easily sends us in the direction of apocalyptic visions. You know the famous sentence that the great American Marxist, what's his name? I forgot, has proposed it's now easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. You can adapt this formula, and of course this explains why the apocalyptic scenarios are so prevalent today. But more generally, we live in a situation where the combination of the three catastrophes radically changes the articulation of time, history, historicity, and action, or political action, collective political action. So they cannot become reflected upon in isolation.
Magnifique. Merci beaucoup, Étienne. Are there more questions? Pressing questions? No, okay, so Étienne, if you want, you can have a coffee if you don't want to sit through the whole event. Or...
No, Jana, I don't want a coffee, but I have a very severe constraint because I find I'm not in my usual place here. So I took the time to participate with great pleasure to your event, but I need to stop at short before 8 sharp, so I cannot continue after 10 to 8 or something like that.
Okay, so just don't worry. Don't worry about that. You can leave anytime.
I don't worry.
Okay. On which I'm going to pass word to our dear friend Alex, who already very beautifully introduced this book in Paris at the Columbia University's Reed Hall. So just floor is yours.
Okay, hi Étienne, and I'm great to see you again, even though you are online. So technology always interrupts us, and then with technology, that's my concept. Anyway, so I totally agree with actually what Étienne pointed out. Actually, we are now is having an age of pessimism. We could see around the pessimistic pessimistic perspective on what's going on these days. Is a total world. The whole world is actually falling apart. And then, but my question is actually, okay, just we will be pessimistic, and then we will be actually quite concerned about what's going on in the world. But, from the perspective of a non-European world, some anthropologists I really admire from Latin America and Africa, the Mbembe, and then all those, the non-European theorists, continuously emphasize those people living in the so-called the rest of the world already experienced, end of their words. That means the whole world already ended, That means it's not just a new experience for us. It's not the new, actually, the epoch. So our ancestors also experienced that one, and then that is a kind of contemporary experience, in my opinion. In this sense, actually, what we have in terms of age of war is actually I don't like this kind of definition, because war, as according to Étienne, that's why we need actually his book. At the moment is his book. I think reorient our the understanding of war toward very new actual dimension, against the kind of very the classical sense of liberalism. According to liberalism, state power is actually the way in which we can guarantee the peace. But Etienne's idea is, in my opinion, really important to the understand the war against this kind of the general the concept of war in the the liberalism. So, for instance, the Thomas Hobbes, and then many actually the liberal the theorists explain, and then geopolitics too, or some kind of international relations study, they always emphasize the established order must be sustained, and then the war is kind of what is a destruction of this kind of destruction of this order, and then it means chaos. But Etienne's position quite opposite to this one. War is not, of course, war could be called chaos, but war is not just the end of the kind of system, but the war as such is a part of this system. That means actually that's why we have a war at the moment. War is just a symptom. It's not the end of the certain system which was described by the liberal thinkers. The peaceful the world is falling apart because of the war. No, it's not like that. War is already internalized within this structure. In this sense, actually, Étienne, the elsewhere is not in this book only. Describe the war as the many actually the aspect of the structure. In my opinion, actually, I prefer this concept is conjuncture, war as a conjuncture, and then that means actually that's why just the first essay which was included this volume discussed Simone Weil's the beautiful essay about Homer's Illiad, and then there actually the Weil described the very famous scene when Priam visited the archery, and then they actually cry for the different actually the reason, but they cry, and then they actually the emotional the respond to this tragedy, even actually the cry for the his lover, and then the Priam cry for his son. But anyway, just this kind of force brought together these people, this enemy and then friend. This distinction is collapsed because of this kind of force. So that is actually the point the Étienne emphasized in this essay. So I think that this is actually we should pay attention. This is what exactly we should pay attention in terms of war. Against what is a normalization of war. So war is not a normal situation. War is a very extraordinary, exceptional situation. And then that's why just our question must be what about how can we actually how can we the restructure this exceptional the conjuncture of war. Not just the normalization of the war. Now the actual technology, I think this rightly pointed by the Étienne. I think really the great insight, because today's digital technology, we have many the argument or some discussion over this issue. For instance, Cedric Durand is like the techno-feudalism, something like that. This actually famous term and the buzzword these days, but I'm quite against this kind of idea. Is we don't have feudalism at the moment. It's kind of the another situation, another actually the exploitation of the capitalism. Capitalism changed their way to exploit the people. Of course, we can use this kind of term, the capitalism keep exploiting people. But how? How actually capitalism can keep actually exploiting people because of this conjuncture. That means a war. They're using a war, and then before today, actually, they secretly did. The capitalists secretly did, like a bourgeois, they secretly did more civilized way. But now, actually, they what? They gave up this civilized way, and then they really what? Actually, very overtly against the civility. It's according to Balibar, actually, that civility is the way in which to prevent, the politics from the violence. Of course, the politics is always, the internalize this kind of balance within its own logic. But civility, this might be called, some the Friedrich Engels term might be public power, and then even actually the people could have, gun. I think today's United States is actually the worst case. How the public power, the stand against their own destiny. That is what I mean actually. But Engels actually in the early stage of American history, quite optimistic too. The American system is American allowed. All people can have gun. That means a weapon to protect themselves. At some point is really nowadays sounds very weird, but in those days, that means what? In Europe is definitely people the prohibited. The people were prohibited to have the weapon to protect themselves. Only sovereignty. Only actually the power elite could do that. But America allowed that kind of certain the way. But America, I think they lost this civility. That's why actually Trump came up because of this. It's not that the Trump came up to the shut down this civility. It doesn't mean that civility is already declining in the United States. That's why Trump can get power. So this is actually symptomatic, the situation in my opinion. And in this sense, the Etienne's, the concept of war is really, really insightful. And then we need to take this concept and to rethink actually what's going on in terms of normalization of war. I think this is a really dangerous situation, normalization of this kind of conjuncture. So, in my opinion, the conjuncture means, what is opened, the contradiction, where some the class, or the race, or some, some capitalism, even some the nationalism, every kind of ideological contradiction comes up, through this kind of the conjuncture. But what? That's why actually Elon Musk and then even Palantir and then even Trump. Nowadays, I think you can see that this is a holy alliance, total holy alliance, And then this is actually exactly what Karl Marx described in the Communist Manifesto. It's a holy alliance. What is this holy alliance doing at the moment? Try to exploit this war as such, and using this war. And then try to keep their own interest. This is really, really actually the dangerous situation in my opinion. So they don't actually allow us think the war as a conjuncture, but the war as a catastrophe and the war as end of the world. That is a big problem. Conjuncture would give us another opportunity to open, the actual possibility of a new world. But they try to block this kind of possible channel, through which we can reach at a certain, the way actually in which we can build up our friendship, build up some sense of peace, build up new actually what is the idea of politics. In my opinion, they try to what? They try to prevent us from idea of communism, commons. They try to what? The prohibit. We actually come to think about these commons. So this is actually really, really actually the embarrassed in the situation, but really dangerous situation in my opinion. So and then now that we have this kind of technology and media, and then ignorance, and then definitely what happened in Gaza,
Actually, thing is that Gaza is not just the Gaza only. Everywhere. I told you that even in the age of colonization, and then also Etienne, correctly on the write-up is violence is always there, and then actually Gaza is not just very unique case which happened today, but it actually was continuation or repetition of this kind of violence in human history. So and then. They actually try to prevent our the thinking from this sort of the realization of a truth. That's what I'm thinking. So in this sense, the Balibar didn't actually take war as sort of tragic the consequence of our politics. He didn't say like that. That war is a kind of a conjuncture. When the politics is turning into some crisis, right? And then of course there's when the politics is the losing in the civility. So that is actually the my own idea is in this sense the rethinking war is the allow us rethinking war actually allow us to think what is to be done, and then what is important is what is to be done. Not we actually deplore, actually like the romantic the philosopher, in 1910 and 1920, and then they actually really fall into this pessimistic the symptom, and then they deplore, and then they actually really actually there's some kind of suicidal actually the gesture something like that, but not like that. I think we should actually rethink war, and the war also opened the ambiguous situation. That's why even Paul the Trump and Paul those the bourgeois who try to actually the keep on this kind of their own power and their own status quo would cause some kind of a risky moment. So Lenin said the war or revolution. Of course, actually nowadays it's not easy to say we must choose war or revolution. But it's not optional nowadays. But we shouldn't actually, go to this catastrophe. Exactly actually those, people. That means bourgeois people actually really want at the moment. Just think about that. Digital technology. Okay, just we quite easily say that digital technology actually bring us, quite of efficiency and then convenience. But they actually persuade us. You must sacrifice your future for this convenience. And then they actually extraction lots of the natural resources, and then they knew actually what's going on these days on this earth. Etienne also pointed out is like an ecological crisis. The ecological crisis is not even, it's not equal. We are not equal. In front of this kind of ecological crisis. Always the social inequality is reflected on this. The crisis in the crisis at the ecological, the condition. For instance, the people living in the Manila, they cannot actually have same the equality with those people living in the Europe, all right? And then America also, even within America, the United States, same. Is those people living in the poor condition experience the climate change the more actually extreme way. That's what I mean. So in this sense, actually, we need actually Etienne's interpretation of a war, which was actually well described in this book, small book. And then, but I think the idea is really, really big. The insight. And then taking on this one, and then it's time to rethink. What is to be done. In the age of war. And then against this kind of ignorance, against this kind of normalization of. Exceptional conjuncture. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex. And finally, the last word. I would like to pass the micro to Petr Kouba, and then we do questions. What do you think? Does it work?
Thank you very much. Jana, first of all, I would like to thank you for giving me the opportunity to comment on Étienne Balibar's most recent book, which I find truly important, and I'm really happy to have this possibility and say a few words about it. The book Sur la guerre is significant in its own right, as it resonates deeply with the fundamental themes of Étienne Balibar's thought, but it is also important today because it is highly relevant. What is essential is that the author thinks here as a philosopher. That is to say, he does not present another lesson in strategic studies, of which the public sphere is currently overflowing, but rather demonstrates the necessity of conceptual thinking if we are to make sense of what is happening to us and around us. As Étienne Balibar says in his essay on the war or wars in Ukraine, we are a general war within our great continent for the first time since the end of Nazism. We are in this situation due to an aggression that is absolutely contrary to international law, which leads to total war and carries within it the risk of nuclear escalation. It will permanently disrupt the lives and worldview of all Europeans. Our responsibility is therefore full, both regarding the choice of analytical categories and the consequences to be drawn from them. There is no point in deluding ourselves. We, as Europeans, are today at war with Putin's Russia, and what Étienne Balibar enables us to do is to think war from within it. War is not viewed here from the distance afforded by a state of peace, but from within. Since I do not have enough time to comment on the book Sur la guerre in all its intellectual motives and connotations, I would like to limit my commentary to three basic motives that seem fundamental to me and that are intrinsically related. These motives are the violence of war, the birth of a nation in the political sense, and the experience of the tragic. The connection between the first two themes can be found in reflections on Homer's Illiad. Here, Homer essentially captures the origins of the Greek nation. Thucydides clearly attests to this in the history of the Peloponnesian War. Right at the beginning, he claims that before the Trojan War, the Greeks didn't exist as a nation. They lived scattered across the islands and engaged in piracy. For them, the war was a tremendous demonstration of economic power, as they were able to assemble such a vast fleet, which Homer carefully describes at the beginning of the Iliad. The war against Troy was the momentum for the political unification of the Greeks, the next chapter of which was then written much later during the Greco-Persian Wars. Étienne Balibar describes something similar in his essay on Ukraine. Here we see the birth of Ukrainians as a political nation. Against Putin's rhetoric, which claims that Ukrainians are not a nation, that they do not exist as a real nation, stands the power of national resistance. In Sur la guerre, Étienne Balibar claims that what we see in Ukraine is actually the war of independence, and that the Ukrainians are pulling themselves from the existence from the national existence in a maybe cultural sense, and they are coming to exist as a political nation, as a civic nation. And one could say the same applies to Palestine. Also, there are only few explicit mentions of Gaza in the book Sur la guerre. It is clear from Étienne Balibar's many public appearances that the war in Gaza is, for him, a synonym or symptom of today's political situation. As we read in the book Sur la guerre, Gaza, in other words, the ethnocidal and genocidal violence, responding to and using political religious terrorism as a pretext, symbolizes this situation all by itself. As in the case of Putin's rhetoric towards Ukraine, the ability to make sacrifices in the face of Israel's overwhelming military and technological superiority, stands in opposition to all those who claim that Palestinians do not exist, that the Palestinian nation is merely a Marxist or leftist fabrication. War is revealed here not only as the establishment of political nation, but also as the perseveration in the face of genocidal forces. The question, however, is whether it makes sense to speak of war in the case of Gaza. We may be using the word war carelessly, without reflection, and rather to avoid the necessity of understanding the true meaning of what is at stake here. What we see in Gaza, not just those days, but over these years, is a punitive expedition, Strafexpedition. Obviously, punitive expeditions were and are common strategy of colonial wars, mainly targeting the civilian population. We can think of the German punitive expeditions in Namibia, exterminating the Herero and Nama tribes. But there are countless other examples in the infamous history of European colonialism. As the term itself suggests, a punitive expedition has no other purpose than to punish and suppress any resistance. In the case of Gaza, this is quite clearly punitive expedition with no end in sight. Literally, it is endless punitive expedition. If we wish to find some measure of humanity here, it is not enough to invoke human rights and international conventions of war, which are just systematically ignored today. If we wish to preserve at least a measure of humanity for ourselves and understand that even revenge must have its limits, we might reconsider the meaning of tragedy. Even revenge must have some measure. Greek custom tells us, even revenge must not exceed certain limits of proportionality. It is precisely this proportionality in the face of adversaries that Étienne Balibar points out in his first essay dedicated to Simone Weil and the experience of the tragic in Homer. What we see here, when talking about the tragic experience, is the conflict of adversaries that bring death to each other, but in this clash, they are complementary. They stand against each other, confirming their existence, but they realize that they find themselves in the same situation. If we wish to deepen our understanding of the tragic even further, we can find a possible guide once again in ancient Greeks, this time in the tragic poets. Specifically, I'm referring to Aeschylus the Persians and Euripides the Trojan woman. Aeschylus demonstrates not only the capacity for compassion, but for identification with the enemy through what connects us to the enemy, namely the risk of hybris as an overstepping of human limits. This hybris is, in fact, something that allows us to realize that we are the same as our enemies. Euripides, in turn, illustrates the risk of exceeding human limits even more sharply by depicting war not from the perspective of men and victors, but from the perspective of women and defeated. I think it's really wonderful to think of this counterpart to Homer's Illiad, where the story, of course, is a story of rage and revenge, but it's told from the perspective of man and victors, whereas Euripides in the Trojan woman presents the other side of the war, the other perspective of the war, and it is war depicted from the perspective of women, children, the slaves, the defeated. So what we see here, what we can find here, is the experience of tragic that is topologically transformed and inverted, while hybris as an excess of violence remains its fundamental point. It is precisely this experience of hybris that brings us closer to our enemies. But does it even make sense to speak of the experience of the tragic when the killing in Gaza is controlled by AI algorithm? Do human standards and human responsibility still apply here when killing is left to the care of artificial intelligence? In connection with the mass deployment of drones in the war in Ukraine, we often talk of zones of death zones. We should not forget, however, that all of Gaza is still such a zone of death, a zone where people do not live but wait for death. Death may not come immediately. Perhaps it will come tomorrow or the day after. But it is certain to come as soon as a command center algorithm deems it appropriate. It is difficult to find words for this experience. But it seems to me that the concept of extreme violence, which Étienne Balibar uses in his book Violence and Civility, and which we also find in Sur la guerre, is very apt here. It is also of interest to us that the phenomenology of extreme violence is elaborated with reference to Simone Weil and her reading of Homer. And similarly, we read in the book Sur la guerre, there is a more important term, that of petrification, which connotes the strictly phenomenological moment in Weil's reading, the moment where she characterizes extreme violence through the reduction of the other person to impotence, and thus annihilation of their capacity for resistance. This is, in fact, Étienne Balibar's definition of extreme violence. It is the violence that reduces other to think, even though the other may still be alive, he or she is not existing anymore. He or she finds himself, herself in the situation where death seems to be bearable or more bearable than life itself. It is the life deprived of its very capacity for resistance. Étienne Balibar also uses the concept of extreme violence in connection with the war in Ukraine. Let us begin with the characteristics of the war in Ukraine as an outburst of extreme violence, he says. How else can we think of the human safari that the Russian army has set up on the streets of Kharkov, where it systematically hunts defenseless civilians? What is terrifying, however, is how easily we can forget that the fact that the same human safari is still operating throughout Gaza. Moreover, in Gaza, there is no question of reciprocity between the war parties. Two regular armies backed by military-industrial complexes are not facing off here. There is only a military technological system with unlimited capacity for killing, and a civilian population with medical personnel, firefighters, and perhaps the remnants of some paramilitary organization. And yet, here we are witnessing live the birth of a nation in the political sense, whatever the fate of this nation may be. A political community is literally being born from the ruins where extreme violence reigns. In the face of three of these events, of which we are part, whether we like it or not, Étienne Balibar's book offers us a unique opportunity, the opportunity to begin thinking. Not merely to use prefabricated slogans and pre-prepared arguments, but to think philosophically, even if we may be unpleasantly surprised by the conclusions to which such a thinking leads us. And for this experience, I'm extremely grateful to Étienne Balibar.
Thank you so much, Petr. Thank you so much, Alex, for these amazing talks. Maybe before we pass to the audience, I'd like to briefly react with 2 points that kind of strikes me actually in your talks. I was a little bit surprised, Petr, to what extent you bring this notion of the nation state as, you say birth of the nation, or which again, I'm not sure if it's really Étienne can correct us, but I'm not really sure this is what actually appears in the book, because to a certain extent, like, we could think of this problem of this nation state as being the sort of a result of a kind of a false dialectic that we're dealing with here. And that brings us with even, by the way, next week on the 18th, in this very same space, we're doing a workshop on Rosa Luxemburg, introducing a new Czech translation of her writings to the audience. And this actually brings us to Rosa Luxemburg's polemics with Lenin around the question of the nation state. And we could ask to what extent actually this birth of a nation state is like a kind of a pathological symptom of that extreme violence that's being exerted, which actually brings a certain finitude also, to the process. Because, like, we don't have to forget that even, like, you talk about the nation state, you talk about the community, but I don't know, like, in case of the Ukrainian war, what is it? Like, the classes, the social classes, not everyone in Ukraine is facing the war in the same situation. I mean, there were cases where, like, the draft is being applied to different social classes in different ways, So, again, like, to me, like, this... I think you speak about it in a very idealistic terms, but we don't have to forget that the nation, the nation state is already a problematic term. That's a symptom, precisely perhaps, of this violence, that's being exerted through the war. And maybe Alex could because we had this discussion about the nation state. Like, maybe you would like to react on. What do you think about that, or both of you?
Yeah, so I didn't discuss it in my previous talk, but I think actually, if you think about war, I think that is always related to state. Okay, just nation state. Okay, nation state, in my opinion, very the modern invention. The before nation state, very European invention. Because Asian people didn't have a nation state before the 20s. So Wang Hui is a very famous Chinese thinker. The Chinese people didn't have any concept of century before 20th century. So we didn't have a concept of nation. Think about the monarchy. We don't have a nation. That means actually the king cannot be actually equal to the common people, all right? Just like nation. If you have a nation state, actually you need you need to have this kind of presupposition. Everybody, the member of a nation is equal. This is totally actually what Étienne really beautifully actually described in terms of equal liberty. Is that presupposed equal liberty. So equal liberty as such is really conjunctural term. Is nation state the same? It's conjunctural. It's very contradictory. Actually the state. The nation never actually met, before, but 20th century European, the European Enlightenment made this actually new idea of a state, then nation state, and then now there is through colonization, and then some kind of some world war, and then it's spread up, across the world. That is actually what we have in terms of a nation state. So in this sense, actually, we should start from this concept is. The nation state, from the perspective of modernity, is not quite the normal situation. The nation state is not a normal state. It's very extraordinary state. It's really actually specifically invented by the certain historical moment. So in this sense, war is more actually, in my opinion, actually what is universal. Rather than that is what the Deleuze-Guattari discussed in terms of a war machine. War machine as I think that is also the Deleuze-Guattari very clarified very well is how the war actually the dismantle the state,
that means actually state is not just the war machine. Is a state is the capturing machine. Is an apparatus of capture. So the state is captured in this war machine, and the war machine is universal. So in this sense, the Etienne's the concept is civility, and then also his concept of conceptualization war as conjuncture really important. But the Deleuze-Guattari's concept of war machine wouldn't give us any the responsibility. How can we actually engage this kind of the war? For instance, actually that is exactly what's going on at the moment. Is the Petr pointed out in his talk actually the Ukraine war. What is the Ukraine war? I think it really actually the new sense of war actually established through this kind of Ukraine war. And then Gaza, and then I think Gaza is, in my opinion, the second leg of this Ukraine war. Is when I visited, the Shanghai, the last year, I saw the many, Russian tourists from Russia. So I just took one guy, is a very poor guy. I asked him, "What do you think about the war? And you have a war, but why do you come to China for shopping or the sightseeing?" But he said, honestly, I was very surprised. He said, that is just, our government war, not a war for us. I think that is exactly what we have at the moment is terms of war. That means actually this Putin or some, Trump or some, in my opinion, some techno, the crowd, these days who owned this kind of some, the right of property, and I think they don't want actually us to discuss the war. They don't want us to actually recognize the war as a conjuncture. They at some point they try to suppress war, and then they simply transform this war into some technological sense. That is exactly, in my opinion, problem of state. State is, in my opinion, technology. As Thomas Hobbes said, what is the Leviathan? Leviathan is actually the machine, the cyborg. He said artificial man, that is state. That is exactly now realized by what? This technology, today technology, is what Etienne pointed out, is a digital technology. Is at some point extreme actualization of early, the imagination of liberal political philosophy. And we need actually dismantle this ideology. And then a nation state, in this sense, just technology. And then now the way nation state, at some point, actually it has its own ideology as a nation state, but we don't have any nationalism. Only what? MAGA, for instance, in my opinion, new fascists actually talk about, but even, the fascists nowadays, as, the Albert Toscano, my friend, actually pointed out, late fascism, they don't talk about nation. They talk about freedom. I think that we are in the new situation. That means the nation state, is symbolized at some point is a kind of, some old-fashioned machine. But actually, this is, in my opinion, is at some point a very superficial, concept. We need to actually think. We need to think actually what is a war rather than nation state. Nation state, it must be dismantled. And then, they try to protect this nation state from this kind of deconstruction. That is what I'm thinking. So, I think that's why I said Engels, the Engels and then Etienne, even, Deleuze-Guattari thought, the state is not really normal state. Actually it must be dismantled by, certain, force. Is as you said, is kind of some tragic force, by which the all kind of, the being turn into thing itself. And then that is exactly, actually, you actually, in my opinion, a starting point. Okay.
Petr, would you like to react?
Sure. First of all, I need to clarify some misunderstanding. I was not referring to the relation between war and nation state. It would be trivial and deeply problematic to claim that the nation state rises out of war. But it seems to me, and I believe I read Étienne Balibar's text carefully, that he's claiming something way more surprising and subtle. Namely, he claims that the Ukrainians as a nation were born in this war. However, the Ukraine as a state already existed. So Ukrainians, as he claims, are fighting the war of independence to defend themselves against the Russian imperialism. But Étienne Balibar compares this fight to Algerian war, for instance. And therefore, we see the possibility of nation that is reborn or newly born in the situation where it already has its state. And at the same time, we can think of Kurds, who might never have their own state, and yet they are fighting for their independence, for their integrity against numerous enemies on various battlefields. So I think what we need to reconsider here, together with Étienne Balibar, is connection between violence and the existence of political community, which is far from national state as such. And maybe we can pass word to Étienne to bring some light into this debate.
Yeah, I don't really buy into it better, but maybe Étienne can explain us better.
Explain. Well, first of all, I want. Can you hear me? Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Okay. Because I have an indication on my screen. So first of all, Alex Harrell for extraordinary commentary, fundamental directions. So certainly not able the solution for all these riddles, and you, Jana, but you both
Yeah, Étienne, we don't hear you. I think it just fell. It's a mystery. What's this question?
Étienne? At the time of the construction of this 73 essays, I did not have the ability and to add considerations on guerre. So they are in footnotes, etc. If I may, if I'm allowed to add a kind of reading list or something like that, I wrote several essays on the situation in Gaza in the last year and months, and we're cut. I no longer see you. I no longer. Can you hear me?
Yes, now we hear you. There was a pause, but now we hear you. We hear you.
So I take the liberty. I ask your permission to direct you to an essay that was published first in French and then translated into English. You will find it website of with a friend of mine, an Italian friend of mine called Luca Salza. So what I find important here is what I find important here is the fact that both in the case of Ukraine and in the case of Gaza, we have to do with situations of completely dissymmetric confrontations. But they are not dissymmetric to the same degree because the Ukrainians are resisting. They resisted the first attack, assault, and then the second, and then the third. They reversed the strategic relationship of forces at some point, and now it's a kind of uneasy balance. The dissymmetry is also, Alex is absolutely right to point at that, between the fact that the populations, the peoples, are not involved in the war in the same manner on both sides. That would call perhaps for more subtle descriptions and a better understanding of the internal situation in both states and countries. I'm not an expert on that. But in any case, the situation is not a situation of absolute unbalance of forces. The Ukrainians are resisting. And in the case of Gaza, I'll come to this in a minute. But the situation is clearly radically different. And of course, Karel gave a perfect description of the situation, talking about the disproportionality of the strategy of revenge and the fact of course, I find this terrible, but I completely agree that we have to do with a death zone. It's a kind of protracted genocide. When you say the people in Gaza, the 2 million people in Gaza, they don't know if death will come the day after or 2 days after, but what is certain is that it will come. And so that's a situation of absolute destruction of a community physically and morally, and et cetera, et cetera. So this, in both cases, there is dissymmetry, but the dissymmetry is of a different kind, of a different nature. Then I come to my second remark, if you allow me. Karel, I thank you particularly for bringing in Thucydides and Euripides. I could not dream of a better complement and expansion of what I've tried to say through Simone Weil and Homer. This is beautiful. And then, of course, I thank you for quoting my formulas from 2022, from the year 2022, about the construction of the Ukrainian nation within their war of independence. But if you read my book to the end, I added a postscript in 2025. That is a year ago when the book was completed, in which I had to qualify some of the judgments that I had proposed. And here we have to be extremely careful, because you said I'm trying to talk about the war from within, so that involves that I'm not taking the upper ground position from which I can say these people are right, blah, blah. The Ukrainians fighting their war, I'm not trying to teach them lessons. This being said, what I said precisely is that I was hoping, or I was believing that we could observe in Ukraine in the last, throughout this war, the birth not of a nation, but of a civic nation. Nationalism in Ukraine is a very old story, and even the state has existed, and there's the whole question of federalism within the Soviet Union that Putin at the beginning of the war said this is all Lenin's fault because he was for federalism and not blah blah. So leave that aside, it would take too much time. I said we are perhaps observing the birth of a civic nation. And then in my postscript I said I'm sorry to say that what I observed today in Ukraine, and perhaps this was inevitable, or perhaps this is extremely difficult to avoid, is a form of patriotism, which is in fact nationalism, which is not civic. It's not a civic nation, or not completely, it's an ethnic nation. And the main argument, or the main sign or symbol of that I see, and I feel this very deeply, is the fact that Ukraine in this moment believes officially to be at the level of the grassroots. It's very different, but officially they believe not to be able to resist the invasion and fight their war if they do not eliminate completely from the Ukrainian culture what they claim to be the colonial imprint of the Russian legacy, which means that you are no longer allowed to speak Russian, that Russian books written by Ukrainian writers, Gogol and others, are thrown away and expelled from the shelves of the libraries, that the schools teach only Ukrainian, whereas throughout modern history, the population there, of course, was multicultural and bilingual, at least. So this is not the birth of a civic nation, or at least there is a tension, there's a conflict. So perhaps this is an old story. You could argue that war is not the perfect situation for the birth of a civic nation. It encourages nationalism and ethnic feelings. Even the French people during the French Revolution is a perfect example for that. They claimed that they were bringing to the world a civic idea, a republican idea of the nation. And in fact, what they created was French nationalism and others. So I agree that this is a permanent tension, but I see the situation as less clear, less simple, and less progressive, if you want, as I had believed initially. This qualification is very important for me. And it leads me to the last point, which is back to the case of the Palestinians. So are the Palestinians building a nation one way or another within this totally asymmetric war? I'm not sure of that. I'm not sure. And clearly the Israeli offensive and their Straf, that's a great term, it's terrible, etc. That operation is particularly, of course, meant to eliminate and to suppress every possibility for the Palestinians to create a nation. But what I argued in the text I referred you to, text published by Verso, Conversation on Gaza with Lucas Salza, is that the Israelis are not able to completely destroy the community, I would say, of the Palestinians wherever they live and as a people. So we need different concepts. We need state, we need nation, we need people. These are notions which, of course, are intertwined and intersect, but they're not identical. So clearly the Palestinians have no state. I'm not sure that they have or will have a nation, but they remain a people. And that puts a limit, of course, to the capacity of the Israeli to suppress the resistance. The extreme violence is there. The definition that I proposed, and I thank you for accepting that definition of extreme violence, is it not only it curbs, but it crashes and it destroys the possibility of resistance. But there is an element of resistance that still has not been destroyed by the Israelis, even in Gaza. This is the fact that there exists a Palestinian people. So I stop there. The big problems I haven't touched, the conceptual problems, you've raised enormous question. We'll keep thinking about all that. And I thank you very, very much for what you said.
Thank you very much, Étienne. I think it was great and it brought some clarity to this issue of the nation state. I just want to tell to everyone, if anyone by chance is in Paris, so Étienne will be also discussing this book in Paris, actually on June 23 in Librairie L'Atelier in a discussion with Frédéric Nera in the framework of the cycle called Ce qui vient. So that's a real, you have a world tour here.
Thank you very much. And I'm sorry for that. I need to leave you now because my time is limited. So I thank you very, very much, all of you, the speakers, the audience, and Jana for having me in your meeting.
Thank you so much, Étienne.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Applause. And so maybe we should see if there's any last questions or if you want to continue having questions over drinks. Yes?
Thank you. Congratulations on this event. I'm Avital. And your beautiful interventions. I'm very moved and touched. I have just 2 nano points that you may or may not want to engage, maybe with snacks or something. But firstly, I was thinking of bringing into the mix a little bit of Carl Schmitt on the, let's say, conjunction or allegorical tensions or anxieties, not his language, obviously, among politesse, so what you were tracking as civility via Étienne, police, and policy, and how somehow that conjunction, which is in no way something that can merge or emerge without extreme collision, nonetheless creates a certain relation to what you were speaking about in terms of civility and the loss of that, but policing, policy, politesse, and how they do contaminate in also ways that are remarkable. The other thing was apropos of the Benjamin text and other Benjamin texts. I was very moved by your considerations, and in some ways the worldlessness and Weltlosigkeit that we're thrown into is also a regression, I would think, of all-out stupid lethality and extreme warlike behaviors and grammars that don't cover the whole field of war. Because in Gaza, as you were suggesting, it's not only a Strafexpedition, but it's a kind of turkey shoot. It's not even classifiable in some ways, perhaps. But Benjamin, in that text that was evoked initially, also asks to consider invisible war. So he imagines, I think, a mutation in war that we don't even see or feel, that has no phenomenological, let's say, backup. It just hits you maybe in your immune system, maybe in food injustice when you're forced to eat shit, as President, not my President, Trump eats. I think it's very important what he eats and refuses to purge, and so in a Nietzschean way. So those would be my little comments and my gratitude pose and dance of praise for what you've done today. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for great comments. Yeah, so in my opinion, actually, the liberal concept of state, as the Avital, brought up here is Carl Schmitt quite against liberal democracy, and then liberalism always is designed for the controlling, as you said, is policing. Okay, in the other term might be a life. If you like, is a life, or another one is a contradiction or as differences. They try to policy. The policing that kind of actually that some intransferability. That means actually the singularity and the all experience, and then a different differentiation. Actually, they try to control it, but that is actually, in my opinion, the mainstream understanding of a state. But my idea is that this state is also the Étienne, and then all kind of the French philosopher after the 1960s, to emphasize, cannot sustain, and then also that it also actually contains this kind of the force, the within. That is we should actually think about. And in this sense, war is not just a catastrophe. It's a kind of some revelation of this crisis. That means even Michel Foucault also pointed out, that his interpretation of Thomas Hobbes, that he emphasized, the modern state. That means the reason of the state as such, internalize the kind of crisis. That means sovereignty. They said the sovereignty promise the security. But actually the security always is a risk. Actually to change this sovereignty. That means one sovereignty could be replaceable. It can be replaced by another sovereignty, something like that. That is exactly a crisis within this kind of state form. So I think. But the problem is, nowadays, authoritarian movement is a MAGA in particular in United States, really, really influential onto Asian, politics these days. In the internationalization of this kind of MAGA movement is not just the problem within United States. Because the United States is not just one nation state, is a half an empire, half the nation state. So. Because of this, actually, the MAGA is not just the United States. The issue is quite intentionalized and globalized these days. So, and then anyway, just these people, keep challenging this the security of a state. They are the anti-government, and then even they are anti-establishment, and then. They keep talking about the freedom, is that they actually taking over. Of course, quite a pervasive way, but anyway, just taking over the leftist issue. So I think this is a new situation. Of course, actually, what Nazi did, in 1930, already actually they inverted, the all kind of utopian, the idea, and then the leftist agenda. And then actually we also had same situation, but it's not exactly the same thing happen. I don't say we have the same fascism, but anyway. But this actually the strategy has come back, and then we are facing up with same, the problem, those people in 1930 had. And so, and then we need to find out, our own strategy to face up with this kind of situation. That's what I'm thinking. So, so actually, of course, actually, this kind of the consequences, failure of neoliberalism. All right, is of course actually there might be some necessarily failed, but anyway, just is all actually respond to this kind of neoliberalism, and then. But problem is leftist agenda is totally failed these days.
I think that is a big question. How can we actually revive this agenda? Revive this undervalue, or somehow to keep this value from this kind of corruption, whatever called, the fascist occupation. So that is I'm interested in. Also, I think this book would contribute to this kind of strategy. It might not be actually the kind of new strategy, but might be needed, reformulation. Reformulation what we already have learned. But as you said, nationalism and the enlightenment, and the freedom, liberty, revolution, all concepts must be rethought, from today's situation. So very inverted situation, but anyway, actually we must engage. That is our responsibility. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I don't want to extend too much of the time because I think we should progressively wrap up. But I was just thinking, because this kind of a figure that really comes back into all these, discussions is this notion of the Homo sacer. In a way, in what sense? Because you spoke about, the loss of civility, which is linked to the war, and to what sense actually this kind of a terror that's being exerted precisely from the top, from the state power through this kind of a war is linked to not only to the death drive internal to the state system itself, but also I think it was, I don't know if it was Petr or you who mentioned the notion of the reification. Because obviously what happens here is that, the subjects, whether it's the subject of Gaza or, of any territory of people who, whether in the global south or elsewhere, they find themselves at these tectonic lines of geopolitics. And, we're here in Prague, so Prague was also one of the, tectonic lines of geopolitics. To what extent actually these subjects are being turned into objects that can be destroyed, and to what extent in like the MAGA movement or other, you see this form of subjectivity which kind of internalizes this, what Benjamin would call the sex appeal of the inorganic, this kind of a death drive internal to the subjective, configuration, that they internalize this form of a reification, or alienation. You see, in those fascist movements, you see men treating women as objects, to be exploited or eventually destroyed. So you have this, I think there's also a question of a subjective organization, linked to those problems. And perhaps maybe that's where we can think what the possibility of the resistance would be precisely through more subjectification. Because what the system does is precisely trying to reduce the human to, the subject to the object, which then, if it's in those war zones, it's an object to be destroyed, effectively. So I think the resistance here passes through the category of the subject in a certain way. And then obviously, it would be much more complicated to think how to articulate this theoretically as a kind of a topology of the subject in itself. But anyway, that's another issue. Petr, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I would like to get back to Avital's comment. And I'm very glad that you draw attention to Carl Schmitt. And in fact, it brings us to political ontology. And there is a question which I would like to ask Étienne Balibar, who unfortunately cannot answer it anymore. But the question is related to what might be articulated in Schmitt's terms, namely, it's clear what Étienne Balibar is aiming at when he says, he claimed it quite clearly, we are not living in peace that is from time to time interrupted by war. We are living in war, in various wars that are from time to time replaced by peace. And at the very end of his book, at the end of his essay on the war in Ukraine, he refers to Kant's concept of perpetual peace. And I was actually wondering, what is his position? If we put two positions against each other, namely the one of Homer, whose work is Étienne Balibar passionately interpreting together with Simone Weil, and the work of Heraclit in the sphere of political ontology, I wonder on whose side is actually Étienne Balibar. Because Homer, as we know, was criticized by Heraclit for hoping for some peace, or at least for this desperate side, may there be a peace one day. And it seems to me that Schmidt's political ontology is based on the concept of war, on the possibility of war, and the very existence of the political is related to war. So I was actually wondering what's Etienne's position in this polemics between Homer and Heraclit, and maybe we needed to leave it open at least to his last debate, but it seems to me really a fascinating question around which, at least for me, the book revolves.
Well, thank you so much. So maybe that will be the next book by Étienne Balibar, next Constellation. Maybe we should wrap up and have all drinks and talk more informally. I just want to say to conclude to thank you all for this, your great attention and for being here. I need you to do two things right now. So, formal thing, I need your lovely signature and this presence sheet for our institution that's over there at the entrance. And then, as we are a small publisher and every euro or whatever crown counts and we need to pay our bills, I would love you to have a look at the books. And if you want, you support us, you purchase the books, we can accept, we have a little credit card machine, so you can do this in that, where you see this black book on the black background, which is almost invisible. So have a look at that, we'll be happy. And thank you so much. Thanks to my colleagues for this amazing discussion, and thank you for being here.
Well done. Good.
Yes, same for you. Really impressed because I heard you of Aristotle.
My guess was correct.
But at the end of the book, he seems to side with Homer. Because he's not pacifist, but Homer was pacifist. Thank you.
And you, always, top of the line.